Yeah, Rico.
Okay, we're recording. This is using query, April 20, 2020. I had tweeted out a very preliminary agenda, but we can just go with the flow a little bit. I think Chris was going to walk us through some of the latest data stories. We're going to talk a little bit about SQL support, although I think everybody on this call has sort of seen that in action already. So in case anybody else joins that hasn't seen that, we might delve into that, and then whatever is on the user minds. In particular, probably the export bug and what we're doing to fix that. Bugs, things like that. Does that sound right, B5?
Yeah, I think we also wanted to spend a bunch of time talking about the push-pull RFC and some other, actually, and if we, I think that, I don't know how long that'll take, but the other bit I think we should address is Dustin's apply RFC would be the other thing to sort of look at and make sure that we're all up to speed on. And if we have some time to move the ball forward on that, that's the biggie that I think I'd really like to get fleshed out because we want to get some planning going on that. So it may be a fairly RFC heavy day, but totally want to see Chris's demo of dataset work.
Cool. What am I trying to do here? Did my thing freeze?
Nope, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was nothing. Okay, so Chris, do you want to walk us through either the top 10 NYC Open Dataset or anything else fun you want to demo for us?
Sure. I wouldn't call them demos, but I'll just give you kind of a overview of what's going on with them. So let me see what I can do here. If I share, sorry, I have many screens that are overlapping each other. Let's do this. So yeah, so Turnstile's data set, which has been pretty popular, just updated again. So nothing dramatically changed, but behind the scenes, we've got a more streamlined process. So I added some code to just do one shell command and update it in about 3 minutes. Still depends on very heavily on a Postgres database that I have running locally in a Docker container, but is pretty smooth and runs without any flaws right now. So it should be very easy to update. The new data comes out sometime on Saturday afternoon usually. So this is the tweet that went out right after that data came out, which was basically showing a slight increase, but you can barely tell in the past week of ridership from the last two. So I feel like this is the normal for the lockdown in New York City. So that's that. And then let's go to the query blog. Sorry, medium.com/query.io. Okay, so yeah, we released another data set, which we're calling, what are we calling it? NYC Open Data Archive Catalog Metadata. So this is a blog post we wrote on it, but basically lots of metadata in the NYC Open Data portal that's not readily available in bulk. So things like the view count and the download count, among other things. Also, this agency information is actually not a standard metadata field in the platform they're using. So that's like a custom metadata field, but you can access it via a JSON feed for each data set. So basically what we did was hit the metadata API for all 2,700 and some odd data sets that are on the Open Data portal and just captured all the information and just put it into a table. So pretty basic and then really easy to rerun. It takes about 3 minutes to hit that endpoint 2,700 times, maybe 4 or 5 minutes actually. But this is what we get is the ability to do this download count, top 10, things that showed up that were not, I mean, I think this validates that download count is not a very good proxy for utility or popularity because this number 2 position is held by something called overhead electronic signs, which is what it sounds like, but it's just signs that are in the street for messages that you see when you're driving around on the highway. Which I don't think, there's no reason for it to be downloaded that much because it's not even updated that much, but somebody's downloaded it a whole lot and it's kind of probably skewed the numbers. But there are some other ones that are the usual suspects that you would expect to see up there. So there's plenty more we can do with this data set. For example, I mean, this was actually very interesting too, is just seeing the all the different update frequencies that exist. You see very commonly annually, monthly, daily updates, but there are a bunch of time frames in here that we didn't even know existed. So once we have the entire data set, it's kind of interesting to see that, you know, they've added several times per day, biweekly, triannually. I want to know what those data sets are that are updated triannually and why 3 years is a good time frame for them. So anyway, mildly interesting, and maybe a good index for people who, you know, want to do more analysis on the utility of the Open Data Portal and how people are interacting with it. So that's all I think I have to share at this point.
Wait, do we know triannually means every 3 years and not 3 times a year?
I'm not sure on that actually. Yeah, I don't know.
That would make more sense, I think, but who knows?
Right, you're right. Biannually means, okay, yeah, biannually.
Both, the terms are ambiguous, so who knows?
I definitely Googled biannually just to make sure that it meant twice a year and not once every 2 years. Which now that you mention it, I don't think I did that for triannually, and that sounds about right. So it's probably in every 4 months and everything.
Maybe it means they just try every three times a year.
They try annually.
No, I'm not allowed. No dad joke sympathizers in the crowd. I get it.
Kicking in, yeah.
That's phenomenal, Chris. It's really fun to see. Particularly, yeah, just some background on that. Like the Turnstile data set has also driven a bunch of bug fixes on the engineering side of people trying to download and export it, which I think takes us to fixing export on desktop, which we just merged a fix, and we're going to try and cut a patch release on both backend and front end this afternoon, just to get those out into the wild. That's our update on that. But yeah, awesome stuff. Anybody want to jump in on any data? Actually, we should start getting into the habit of this. At Query, we are now starting to like kind of actively think about data sets that we think would be valuable to have in the world. And so we're now having these high value data set conversations of just stuff that and everybody gets to pitch what they think would be worth doing. And then if somebody feels that there is consensus that it should be done, we're going to try and do it. But to that end, if you come up with ideas for high value data sets, Chris, can you share the repo that you've been putting the Turnstile code in, and that you, Rusty, and Christos have been mainly doing your work around?
Sure. Let me share my screen again real quick. So the repo is called data-stories-scripts. So in it, you'll see these directories like Brooklyn Bus Times and California State Parks, which was one that Rusty worked on. The Turnstile counts is in NYC-Turnstile-counts, and it's got the SQL scripts and the shell scripts and stuff in it. So yeah, if you follow this repo, you'll be able to keep tabs on updates to our pipeline, our third-party scripts for automating data pipelines and some of the visuals that go along with them as well.
Yeah, and we're also using the issue queue in that repo to track stuff that we're working on. So hopefully you'll see stuff come across the wire. Yay, fun. Yeah, with that, I think we want to shift gears a little bit and talk RFCs. So the one that I think I'd really like to sort of get some feedback on, Rob, thank you so much, everybody who has not seen Rob put some feedback on Friday into the push-pull RFC. Just quickly like working through some of that. Just before the call, I pushed some of the fixes to that, just basically finishing it. I published it in an unfinished state because I was just like, we need to get chatting about this. But has everyone had a chance to sort of like just briefly take a look at the push-pull RFC and what we're talking about here? I can do a high-level description of it, just even for the recording. Okay, yeah, long story short is right now Query has 2 commands. We're talking specifically about the CLI. We have 2 commands, one called publish and one called add, which are basically publish is the way that we take a data set locally and put it on the registry. And then add is the way that you take something off the registry and pull it to you. Yeah, I shouldn't have said pull, and bring it and download it, basically. For a long time, we've thought that the phrase add is terrible, and we wanted to replace it with clone. But in this RFC, we sort of talk about how I think clone is actually a slightly separate thing, because the word clone comes to us from Git. And when you clone something in Git, it does two things that we can do. It downloads it and it checks out to a directory. And so the RFC that I've got up just basically says that we should do away with the idea of publishing and unpublishing as a metaphor, and instead just have the idea of pushing and pulling, and also have clone, which would do exactly what Git does, where it would both download an initial version and check it out. Just like Git, clone would only work once, and so you have to run it the first time to sort of get the data set and get it checked out, and then everything from there forward would be pull instead of clone. But pull would be the way that you sort of just continually stay updated to data sets. The way that pull actually works is different from Git, but I think it's close enough that it matches kind of in spirit to the way that it works. And the way that push works in query is a little different from the way it works in Git. The big reason for this is just data sets get big and version histories get really large. And so the big thing that this RFC proposes is that not just the replacement of the phrase publish, but the idea that push should be very greedy in the sense of pushing as many versions of a data set starting at the most recent and working backwards as the remote will allow. And that pull will only grab the latest. And then on both sides, you have flags that let you change that behavior to say, I want to push only the latest, or I want to pull everything. So it's very easy to sort of flip them around. But yeah, I wanted to sort of get that on the table, get some initial reactions from others and see what they think. It's important that we sort of discuss this out loud because this is a change to our nomenclature and a change to the phrasing. And I think we should just make sure that we do this sort of with a little bit of feedback first. Yeah. Does anybody have any initial thoughts?
I didn't know about the RFC. I've thought for a while that harmonizing the terms, the nomenclature with Git would be a good idea. I didn't know whether you had a reason for doing it the way you did it, but I do like the terms. I haven't read the RFC though.
I won't mourn the death of the word publish, but I think for as long as we've the default behavior of pushing a query data set is to make it visible to the world, we should somehow indicate that that's what people are doing, so that they know that this is an open data platform and they don't quite yet have the ability to push this to a repo that is private to themselves or some shared friends or something like that.
Similarly, I don't know if this is like a strong reason or not, but I'm a bit concerned about having our vocabulary line up too much with Git when we work differently. I don't have super strong feelings at the moment on if that's the case here or not.
Totally, those are really good points. I think the word publish sort of there is something nice about the word publish, the idea of like making something really publicly available. This RFC would actually try to coincide as much as possible, and trying to sort of like combine the idea of being able to push to something that isn't a registry in a fairly straightforward manner. If you read through it, the idea is like by default it pushes the registry, but you could push to another peer that would allow you very easily. Dustin, to your point, yeah, the alignment with Git is yeah, I guess the question to you is, do you think that the behavior is so different that it's scary, or that it's like going to be jarring later?
I'm not sure. It's just something to be aware of. I also haven't read the RFC completely, so I'm a bit behind on my homework there.
Asmer.
So my thoughts are generally, I mean, I don't really have an issue comparing to Git commands and generally trying to align them. But even in the other case, I don't really want to have a complete alignment with Git because, as Dustin said, like we don't really have one-to-one parity about what the commands do. On the other hand, I do like that we're changing a little bit the nomenclature because, for me as a new query user, I found it a little bit odd or kind of like out of context for a lot of commands. It just doesn't feel as natural and as meaningful. So the commands are not as meaningful as as I would expect them. So like what's add, what's get, and then or you do checkout, and then it's like there's 10 different things that are all very similar, but kind of do the same thing, just to get a data set somehow on your machine. Now, I understand all the things that are underneath it, but I would like more descriptive words to be used. So it just gives a little bit more context to the users. And the second thing being, if possible, I would like to start and funnel them down into less and less commands, because I think a lot of people will probably want to mostly use the happy path, and that's probably like 1 or 2 commands at most. And then you can flag off the special cases like, hey, I want to just add it like a link, but I don't really want to check it out completely or something like that. So I think those are more like auxiliary use cases than they are like main ones. So generally, I would emphasize kind of like just simplifying and making more user-aware like keywords. But I don't necessarily think that we should try to copy get or something like that. And as I said in some earlier calls, I don't think we should even push query as just a get for data. Like it's so much more.
Yeah, adding to that, I really agree with Asmir's points there. And in addition, we have things like fetch still, which is another way of getting data, but in a non-permanent way, I guess is the way to put it. It would be better if we have the opportunity to kind of like fix the complication around Git and make things simpler and easier to understand. Having less commands that do the default thing well and do it correct is a good way to do that. Again, I don't know if like push and pull is like right or wrong, but we could, for example, like get rid of fetch or make it like a sub mode of pull or whatever it's called, right? So like have one command basically being like, give me something that's on another machine, bring it here. So I think like having a command for clone that is only used in a specific case where like clone is something you're only supposed to run once, I think that makes less sense than just having a command that does the right thing and then having flags kind of customize the behavior.
I think I would agree with a lot of that. The other thing I would say is that for choosing good names, the people on this call are probably not actually the right people to answer that question. Right? Like Dustin just said this, and I remember long ago, right, there was a lot of talk about choosing names and forms of commands that were clearer than Git, since Git has many, many well-known, understandable usability problems. And if the people you want to target, which I hope you want to target, are people who are doing more data analysis and stuff like that, who might use Git less or not at all, I think they're the people to ask or do some research with to make sure that the names you're choosing make sense, rather than like people who primarily write software. I mean, there's probably always going to be a decent amount of overlap in those groups of people, especially for the command line part of things. But like, I think it's worth surveying the people you want to be users about how they think about and mentally model this stuff, more than it is asking the people who are on calls like this.
Wildly agree. Hopefully you see Rico nodding furiously on this. We will take this and workshop this. Chris, you are in Stack next.
I think I echoed Rob's comment about I'm not quite sure how to unpush based on what's in the RFC, and is that even a thing? And then also, I guess what I'm not sure about is the ability to publish without pushing. Like, can I make it so that people can grab it from me as a peer and not have to push it and make it known to all on Query Cloud or on any remote or registry? So those are the things that I'm not sure are captured in those commands, or at least not that I'm theoretically aware that Query can do, but I don't know how to actually do them. So that's what I would bring up. If we want to talk about how you think that's supposed to work.
I was also curious about being able to publish or push or pull specific versions rather than, I guess, is that within the dataset ref itself? How does that interplay with like dash revisions? Can you only ever be working from head? Those questions I had.
Totally. I tried to, starting from Casey, working backwards, I tried to elucidate that in the examples in the text of the like RFC. To pull an individual version, you can actually specify it by hash, but I think you can also pull, you can say revisions is equivalent to the way it does the tilde. So you could do query pull -- revisions 5, and that'll just pull from head 5 revisions back. But they would be mutually exclusive.
But they're not, if you're pulling five back, are you pulling all of them, including 5 back? And do we allow some like randomly pulling a specific version without also?
Yeah, I mean, because totally, and I feel like this is the big thing with our universe, right? We don't want to pull entire histories, and so it has to be the case. I mean, it's currently the case in query all over the place. Exhibit A is the NYC Turnstile dataset, where like you can have spotty histories where you might have a version and then 6 versions gets published and then you have the latest and you don't have the interior ones. So it's absolutely the case that you have to be able to have like incomplete sort of discontiguous parts of a history. And we've been programming around that for a while. So that bit I'm confident on. I think that we just need a better API for, I want that version. And that needs to be really straightforward. It needs to be really easy to be like, give me, head 6 back, or Dustin has constantly talked about the idea of like, if I logged and I could just say the 3rd entry in the log, and being able to just numerically indicate, go fetch the 3rd one. So I think that should, go ahead, Casey.
No, I have a question about, just because we're using the same word or the same flag for that in the proposal and remove, does remove the individual thing, or does remove like all from top to 5 back if you had like revisions 5?
It would remove from top to 5 back. And
okay.
so
remove, so does that yeah. Is that mirrored in pull? Would that be mirrored where you say pull revisions 5 and it pulls head to 5? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the idea, is like, I want to pull the last 5 versions, right? Like that's the sort of human statement that you're making, is I want to pull 5 revisions.
Yeah, we got that UI consistent across commands. It's good.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried, actually remove is one of the more straightforward. And so like that's, for the question, Chris's question about how do I unpublish in this universe, I'm actually proposing this RFC. I don't know if this is going to survive this discussion, but let's find out. The idea that we actually merge that into remove, that I would do query remove -- remote, blah, and then I can name a thing. But what I'm saying is take this off of a foreign place. Just to Asmir's point, like I firmly agree that we should be reducing the number of commands as much as possible. This is very much the sort of like do as little as possible, but no less. Like maybe overloading the idea of remove, because right now the remove only has one purpose, which is data sets that I own, I'm editing history, right? And this is overloading that to say, when you're using remove with the remote, you're saying delete versions from a remote, which I don't know. Go ahead, Dustin.
So I think I like that. And a related question, keeping in mind Rob's point that we aren't necessarily UI experts. But anyway, related suggestion. Part of the RFC mentions talking about combining pull and checkout into clone. Why not just make checkout like aware of remotes and then have checkout be able to do the pull if it needs to? So if I say checkout and then some ref that I don't have, it'll pull it and then check it out.
Yeah. So I think that's what checkout do. I think checkout should be exactly that. Pull. I think checkout in the RFC, I've pointed out that checkout should be pull plus FSI checkout. Oh no, sorry, that's what I'm saying. Clone is. You're saying make that. Totally.
Yeah. One thing that it is a potential problem is that we have been trying to kind of keep network aware operations over here. and everything else, it's obvious that it's not using the network, but maybe that's the wrong approach if the UI gets too complicated to understand.
I think the network distinction has been a really hard one.
Yeah. Like, yeah, maybe we're approaching that the wrong way, and that's part of the problem, right? Like maybe it should be a config setting or something if you really want to go fully offline and stay that way. And it shouldn't be, the commands shouldn't care, right? Like we already have, you can get using a foreign ref, and it will, get someone else's data using a P2P stuff. Maybe checkout should be the same thing. And
those distinctions were also made when, and that design was also made when our network wasn't as reliable and we didn't have cloud, right? So now that it's less, sure. I cannot, or I would feel more comfortable with commands just being network aware rather than having to separate.
Anyone else have thoughts on that? Oh.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the thing that should come with that is not just like a config level setting, but like probably an option on every command that might do something network wise. It says like local only or something. And spending a lot more time in Query Desktop, making sure that everywhere that things might be local versus non-local is sort of like clear. So when you're asking for a version or something, like the timeline should have some clear way of indicating like you have this one and this one, but like this version is not local on your machine, so that if you're clicking on it or checking it out or whatever, like it's very clear that like, oh, this is something that has to be downloaded.
So into that.
Brendan,
go ahead, Chris.
Question on, in the RFC, you added some flags that seem to say that I can push to a peer in the same way that I would push to cloud. How would you imagine? I don't know. It just seems weird. I guess it seems awkward that somebody could push a data set to me and then I don't know. Maybe not. But I would assume I have to give them permission to be able to push a data set to my node. But then can they just turn it off? And is that something we want to do fine-grained permissions on and say you're allowed to push to me, but you can't remove anything that you push? Or is it how do we feel about that?
Isn't that what remotes are? Is this just kind of like broadening that concept?
Yeah, we just haven't talked about it a lot. So like, I don't think we've waved our hands when Chris showed up and we're like remotes, and we didn't really like get into the details of it. Yeah, that's right, Chris. That's exactly what we're sort of saying, is the idea that you should be able to push to a peer that will allow you. And you're exactly right that needs to be an explicit sort of allow listing, not a. And the frustrating thing here is like, this is the whole door of access control that ideally, like we would like to be defining a fairly. Again, like if we think our API is tough now, like wait till we try to layer on, like I want this user to only be able to edit the metadata of this data set, and this other person should only be able to view this, and having like a clean, nice set of defaults for that. So what I'm going to propose, I'm going to add more detail to this RFC, but what I'm going to propose in it is that for now we have just right now the way that we have remotes functioning is, the idea of pushing to remote is a very simple thing. You have to actually, it works very similar to Git, where you actually have to manually define where you're going to push. And so you can say query remote add, and then you say the name of the remote and then the place that you're going to push to. That can be a URL or a libp2p address. If it's a libp2p address, you need to be connected to a peer-to-peer network. And when you are, it will try and find that peer, dial that peer, and push to that peer. And that peer right now, unless you are truly a magician with query, it will just flat out reject you. But if you have, like 4 people on the planet are capable of configuring query to accept data sets from others, right? And this is exactly how cloud works. Cloud is absolutely running that code where it's just a remote that accepts data sets. So what we would add here is just a really simple allow list on the other side that says, I will accept for now just any data set. You really only have 2 mechanisms. I will accept any data set from any user that is on this list, and that will be by their peer ID. And then I have a maximum size that I will One of the things that this RFC doesn't fully get into that needs to be described and really needs to be fleshed out, I think, in this RFC, I think I kind of talk about it, but like the default behavior starts to be, what's the situation when a user, what do we mean by like maximum size is a question that we need to deal with here, where and if we're gonna sort of like have those defaults, I think we need to also define the default behavior for what to do when the whole history of a set of dataset versions exceeds the maximum size. And so what I think I've proposed this in there lightly, but to like make it totally clear, what I think should happen is remotes by default should work like this, and this should be completely overridable. But by default, if you say you have a 300 megabyte cap and a user pushes the 301st megabyte, it should drop the latest version on the remote and accept the head. If a user tries to put, and that should just basically be the rolling rule, is start from head and work backwards and fill your repo with up to whatever your maximum size is. Drop any reference that is older than that. And I think that should be the default behavior. Do others agree, disagree, questions? It has weird implications. So there's definitely weird implications to this.
No, I was thinking that exact same problem where like, how do I get rid of this reaction? Okay. I was thinking the same thing where like, if you tell users that pushing will start from head and then go back in time, then they could just, make a new commit on top of that and then push again in order to like go over the cap. So if you make it so it's like getting rid of the oldest versions, unless they're a pro account or something, that kind of fits into a reasonable model of how it works. Yeah, I think that's what I expected it to do. Yeah.
I'm curious about, like, I don't really know if this falls under the realm of like what a remote is supposed to be doing, but I'm curious about like what responsibility the remote has to the user to let them know that this is happening. What if the user is using this as storage? I mean, I guess like having a pro version sort of solves this, but I was just curious about like, what's the responsibility of the remote to say like, hey, these are all the things that we don't track anymore, and like, or if they get rid of that, what if that's the only copy of the version that exists? I don't know, just.
No, totally agreed. And like, there needs to be some communication here, right? And this is totally coming from our data together conversations about like data stewardship, right? And it's sort of like overlaying the model that we think is motivation based. The originator of the data set, the author of the data set, I think is the principal steward. And so it is right now, as we develop new stuff, we will do things to make their life easier, but I think everything sort of circulates around communicating information back to the author of a data set. And so exactly in the case that you described, Casey, I think that the ideal state we should end in is like a system of fairly up-to-date notifications, like, hey, I'm about to drop, like, even if it basically in the response from a push, someone said, yeah, I accept your push. And by the way, I dropped 4 versions. And so now you don't have, like, you can't count on me keeping those 4. Go ahead, Dustin.
This makes me think of like Dropbox, because Dropbox does something similar where they keep a certain number of versions for a certain number of days, and then they start dropping them. And it's always the newest stuff. I don't know if this is reasonable, but like a better UI would be like, if you push something that goes over the cap, the message is more like, hey, we're going to delete the old version in 20 minutes unless you undo right now or something, So at least give them like an escape hatch. But I think this is something that users would expect anyway. If it's, like a thing where you keep the newest versions. And if not, like that's what, enhanced accounts are for.
I would like to say that this is potentially a huge can of worms that you're opening, and I think it's very much worthy of its own RFC, probably multiple. Just a couple thoughts that are like crossing my mind here. For example, like I'm cool with, for example, we're dropping the like least used or the oldest ones, so kind of like cache eviction style of approach. But then again, I think those things, for example, should be configurable, because maybe I want to be an archive node. I absolutely do not want to drop the oldest. I want to like ignore the newest. Like if you're trying to push over the cap, I don't want that. So things like that. The other thing is like the natural behavior of P2P would kind of like drive out all the like old versions from all the data sets and kind of like browsing data sets. And if you want to go back to in time through the root to the root of the data set, you might not be able to find it because all the like old versions of it got simply like evicted. And now, even though you have the transforms or whatever, you cannot really recreate the original data set because you change it so much that you can't go back in time. And that kind of kills it. Like I'm fine with like the author being like the source of truth, but then it also kills the like P2P type of approach because you start losing more and more data the farther out it goes. So there should be kind of like a balancing act between like who preserves old versions versus who preserves new versions. And this, again, kind of worms, but this brings like things like siege ratios or like different types of buckets like, hey, I'm going to use this amount to kind of like store old versions just for archive purposes or like the most used data sets. And then the other bucket is like for my versions. And the third bucket is for like the newest stuff pushed. And then you have a garbage collector that maybe Dustin was kind of like insinuating like, hey, this will get evicted sometime later tomorrow or something like that. So yeah, definitely this should be probably a much wider conversation. I don't think like solving the remote will be like, yeah, we should do it like this.
I definitely agree. Like this is probably a very complex topic, and especially that like different remotes will absolutely want to behave differently, and there are remotes also that won't care, right? Like Query Cloud actually probably shouldn't care about anything other than you only have X space. But like if I'm a researcher at an institution and the institutional library is really who I view as the actual custodian of the data, not me, like the perspective of that library, if they're running a registry or a query node or whatever, is going to be very much like, you know, like if it doesn't fit, like that is a hard problem that everybody has to stop and address some way. That has to be like we need every version, and if the next one doesn't fit, like we stop the process and figure out how to remediate rather than like some magical dropping of something happening. So like I do think part of this is there might be some standard behaviors that could be configurable and the client could ask for them, or they could be the default behavior of the registry, but like it absolutely needs to be configurable, and one of those options needs to be, and maybe the option for now, because it's the conservative one, is like if it doesn't fit, it doesn't go. And then it's up to either the client or the remote node to figure out like the right strategy to resolve it not fitting. Like, and then the future is to figure out better defaults.
Right. I think it was Dustin said after you push, if you've used too much space, warn that you're going to delete it in a certain amount of time. If you can know in advance of the push, and I think you can, you know, how much space it's going to take up, I think, you know, Rob would say the default was say don't push it at all, but, you know, say this is going to exceed your space, this is what we plan to do to make room, and then say cancel or go.
Could also just give them the command to remove the, you know, the oldest and say, try this first and then push again. Or no,
Right.
It's non-destructive and it's totally up to you and empowers the user. Just an idea.
Yeah, I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of like, because the other thing that we have explicitly modeled right now is that peers cannot, peers can, or remotes can opt into whether they will accept delete requests. And so because there are also peers who are going to say, listen, you can push to me, and that's a one-way street. Like once it comes to me, I'm not honoring any request for you to remove something. And so that exists right now. Accept deletes is by default off, so you actually have to opt in to allowing folks to delete on your machine, which I think is important. I totally agree on the idea of having the defaults of like, and the other side of this is like we've talked a bunch about hooks, and I think hooks are a really great way to get us out of this, allowing infinite configurability. And instead, if we just focused on making in the docs, putting Starlark-based hooks that exhibited the use cases, the behaviors that we've described here. Like Asmer, we could make I'm an archival hook. And so like, to be clear about what hooks are, it's a piece of like where it calls out and runs a Starlark script about whether or not to accept the requested push or pull based on whatever Starlark criteria you want to write. And so then we could basically just write scripts that have the profile that say, cool. Dustin.
I just wanted to say, this isn't super relevant. I love Starlark hooks as an idea. It's super geeky. But I think we also have a lot simpler stuff we got to put in place ahead of time.
I think Starlark hooks are less expensive for us as an engineering team than writing these as defaults in Go code.
You might be right.
Rob.
I think that is maybe true. I think I'm just going to continue on my train of like, don't invent a solution where you don't need one, which is maybe before you launch into the land of Starlark hooks, consider whether like a Unix socket to another program is a better way of doing hooks. And then like, if there are common cases that people are doing, then you can figure out how to make those easily implementable in crazy custom programming language that is really hard to see the errors in and hard to debug, and you can't use packages.
Oh,
I mean,
Rob has a point.
that's fair critique, but also like hooks are probably going to be like compare this size to that and maybe do a string operation. Like transforms that are doing web scraping are infinitely more complicated than something that's just kind of checking some fields. That's my initial estimation. I could be wrong there, but
sure. My counter argument there would be that like, let us consider the like complicated questions around how you want to evict old content when something doesn't fit size, right? Like my hook could be as complicated as like, well, I treat user A, B, and C one way and D, E, and F another way. And I want to make sure that there's always space for these users, but these users don't get that. And so if it's one of these users, then the first thing I do is actually I go remove some old shit from query so that it can just go along and do its thing and return a like success code or whatever, like a continue code, right? So like there's opportunity for whatever is hooking in to like go do some things in query in order to make it possible for the command to succeed. Like, I feel like there is a wide universe of useful things there that like, yeah, it's easy for somebody to get into a crazy place, but you're also sort of like making that contract with an external hook with any kind of custom logic. And I think it's better to give people the set of tools they can already use pretty regularly and easily than to like teach them a new tool that is useful mainly because it's more limited and because query can be more in control. I mean, there are definitely places where that trade-off goes the other way, right? But like, I think that's worth considering.
Asmer?
Yeah, one more view on the whole like Starlark hooks. I actually really like it because I'm just a geek, but I also think it kind of be a middle ground between different types of users. So most people will probably want to go with a simple default like evict oldest or archive mode, and then you just apply like a default stash of different types of hooks, and your default is like don't delete anything and just reject if over the max, and then somebody can do a query config set so like eviction policy 3 or whatever, and you magically hook into that and they're happy, like the universe works, and the majority of people can actually deal with that. So they have a couple different basic ones already set up. But what it also opens up is like very, very deep integrations, like what just Rob wanted to like kind of cover. And I think that's a really nice use case because query should be kind of like a tool set for data people. And this allows you all kind of magic to start happening. So you can like have very custom policies. You can have specific configurations. You can have somebody implement a rate limiter on top of it because, hey, they can just hook into it and do something with it. So there's like all sorts of fancy stuff, and you just let them. It is a powerful tool. It is complex, but if it's worth the trade-off for them to build out the whole kind of like magic repo for themselves, they can do it.
Yeah, this is really close to the way that we implemented cron, even though it's not in a wildly functional state. We supported the idea of both scripting the outside and like being able to put, if basically the convention we use is if you feed it a script that ends in .star, then it assumes it's a Starlark script, checks it, and if it is, then cool, I'll run it at Starlark. And then if it's anything else, it assumes it's a bash script and says, cool, just run this as a bash script. And I think a Unix socket is a better thing than a bash script, particularly for a hook. But the general principle, I don't see why we can't do both. The thing that I really like about Starlark is I can put in our documentation, copy and paste this code into a file, name it this, and this will behave like an archive user. And what we can do is, what I really want to be able, the reason I want to do this is because I want to understand the use cases and understand the foot guns here and how people want to use this. I want to write, and I want the flexibility for us to very quickly sort of like respond to users' different concerns. And if we can write Starlark code against that, what is nice about Starlark is we know it's going to run. It's got, like, we have the execution engine is embedded into the binary, and that makes for a lot simpler of a story. I completely agree that hooks are at bare minimum an advanced use case, and have like a whole bunch associated with them, and that means where we really want to sort of bust out and be really tweaky with it. And so for that reason, I think that the principle we're sort of getting to here is in both cron and hooks, the sandbox does not exist. So you don't have the principle of like knowing that this is going to execute on a foreign user's machine. The intent behind this is it's going to execute on your machine, and you're in charge of copy pasting the right hook and setting things up properly. And we should give you as many super sophisticated tools as we can possibly get going. But the reason I think the notion of hooks is really important is we just don't understand the space very well yet. We don't understand the common use cases. I may want to write scripts that say, this is my personal hard drive, please go delete from my catalog of Simpsons movies to make more room on my hard drive for this before like moving into my query node. There's a million things that are here. But what I want to do is just understand the common cases so that we can either code those up as defaults or make those really easy to implement for users. But we don't know what those common cases are, so we need some space to iterate on this before we hard code some stuff and get into a situation where we end up trying to like come up with not just like the nomenclature shift, but the actual user profiles and use cases that are not only exist, but are interested in using query in the sort of near-term future. Does that make sense? Awesome. Yeah, this is some really good stuff. I think the idea of removing clone in favor of checkout. I want to get the temperature of the room on the idea of remove again, and the idea of remove acting on a remote. I think we sort of left that hanging. Does that jar people? Yeah, I just want to get others' thoughts on that.
I kind of like it. We do need to add a start from oldest option because that doesn't exist right now. Remove always assumes you're starting from head, and that'll be useful even locally, like saying I want to reject my eject my old versions I don't care about anymore.
I think like remove is kind of conflicting with the general use case. Like, hey, I have a data set, and then Dustin, my friend, wants to check it out as well, and it's from a third party, and they were just fumbling around with the data set and just decided to kind of like remove 5 versions of it. And I specifically used this one because I already had it, and I sent it over to Dustin and say, hey, check it out, and he can't because it kind of like vanished in that scenario. Like, I understand there's a full concept like you can force push up on a branch on Git and essentially rewrite the whole history and stuff like that. But I think those are pretty dangerous commands. So generally, I would actually like to remove all those dangerous commands from the like top level of commands, because that's the way you kind of like kill your project, or the newbie comes in on the team and they delete all their data sets because he was unsure about what it does. I think all of those shouldn't be removed, but they should be kind of like hidden a little bit or just moved out of the way, because you're trying to remove something. It's like RMRF and you put a slash and you kill your hard drive, and that's it. I think like you should avoid exposing those kinds of things to the users on their first day. So I mean, power users, that's fine. They'll find their way around, but day one and trying to remove something and then you kill yourself, I don't think that's a great idea. More speaking long term, like right now, most people don't really use it for very, very serious use cases. So like if they delete it, they probably already have it somewhere else and they can bring it back. But if it's to become like a part of the tool chain for somebody, I think they'll want at least a little bit of security so that the next guy won't really just rip out everything and kill it. So I'm fine with it existing, but generally I would like to see it like move somewhere a little bit underneath the covers.
Rob?
As a counter argument, like I definitely agree that it is a destructive and dangerous operation, but I think it is a critically important one, and it needs to not be confusing or too hard to get to for users. So I think it actually is important to have high level, but I do agree like it's destructive and dangerous, and so there should be like plenty of guardrails around it, right? Whether that is a like GitHub style, like type the name of the thing fully to confirm that you want to delete it, or whether there's a like Query Cloud has a like 30-day undo history or whatever, like a clearly stated policy. Hey, you say remove, we're going to hold on to it, just hide it for this long so you can undo it, but then it will actually flush. Because there are plenty of reasons that actually it is critically important that somebody be able to remove, right? If they publish something that's like personally identifiable data or otherwise dangerous, like they have to be able to get rid of that and get rid of it straight away. You know, like there's I think a huge variety of scenarios there. And as far as like locally, similarly, like maybe you need to save disk space, maybe whatever, you know, like you have something that you need to not have. And I think the similar sort of stuff applies, right? Like there should be clear guardrails, but I think it is a really important functionality that needs to be clear and upfront. And I think any user who starts to use query is going to be like, cool, if I publish it, like, how do I fix something that I did wrong? Like, I have to be able to remove. And if I can't, like, screw this thing.
I actually, like, let me revisit my thoughts here. I think actually that's really good input. But I think like there's multiple types of like people that will be using it. And one example of not wanting prompts will probably fall into the bucket of many of the CLI users, because generally I would probably want to pipe things or script around it, and like those kind of prompts, they just kill the buzz. On the other hand, I think a lot of the desktop users, they're like kind of the consumer type, and they would probably be much better hands if they had to check like another checkbox before they do a destructive operation. And I think, well, this is more like a product opinion, but I think CLI is okay to be a little bit more dangerous than the desktop environment. They should both behave the same way. It's just that desktop is kind of like a little bit more defensive for the users, while CLI is, well, if you typed it, it's what you typed and you hit enter. So if you want to like delete your root directory, go for it. I don't know.
Yeah. And so like this, go ahead, Rico, did you? No. Just to sort of fill in some details here. One of the upsides of Logbook is we actually do have the record of what you removed and when you removed. And so the idea of an undo is actually eminently doable because the log is append only, right? So if you create 5 versions and then drop 3 and then add 2 and blah, 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 we actually know and can dig out what happened and write commands that gets you out of your own kerfuffle. I don't know, a number of us on the query team have gone through an experience where Dustin has helped us unmess something up on Git. And it's been a lovely experience.
Yeah,
but yeah, yes. And so that's the thing I wanted to get to, is this question of like, currently remove has 2, like, or the way we're discussing remove, there are 2 things that are happening. If I'm the author of the data set and I type remove, I'm editing history. And if I'm not the author of a data set and I type remove, I'm editing storage. And I don't know if that feels right.
We already have this complication in remove though, because we have things like when you remove, it could be deleting stuff that's in a checked out directory, or it could be deleting stuff. And No, it actually never deletes stuff in IPFS. It'll unpin
No.
things and it'll change your references. So we already have a lot of things happening in remove, and there is like some configurability over how that acts. I think changing how things are stored on a remote that you've kind of like intertwined your workflow with makes sense in that respect.
On
oh, sorry.
on what Asmir said, it's sort of off track for remove, but for keeping the dangerous commands away, instead of like putting a flag like force, and this is still something you just get used to typing automatically anyway, but instead of adding a flag like force, put all the dangerous commands as a subcommand under, in the vein of Rust, under query unsafe remove, or query danger remove, or query footgun remove. Stack them all up under there, so you are typing, I know I might damage, I might remove data here. I know I might damage my data set. But yeah, people get used to just clicking warning dialogues in Windows, so it might not gain you anything. But putting them all in one place might make it more obvious.
Rob?
I definitely want to echo the like people get used to clicking warning dialogues or just typing force. And I think that's a good reason for the like type the name of the data set to really confirm this type of thing dialogue, because that prevents you from just being able to get used to that. But the last thing you said, Brendan, I think is actually a huge deal, that it's a different operation depending on whether the owner or not owner of a data set. I wasn't thinking about that aspect of it at all. And I think probably it's really important that those be very different commands. To what Chris also just wrote in the sidebar, which is like, I think that the operation of like, throw away this version from my machine, like I don't want the body here anymore because I want to save space, should be a totally very clearly different operation to ask to do, not just based on who you are, than the operation of like I'm editing history and like removing this command from this commit from history. Like I think those need to be super clearly separated. So if they both live under query remove, I think that's probably bad. Just to put that forward.
May I suggest query purge in order to get rid of IPFS blocks to clear up storage?
Yeah, I was gonna say drop, purge, some phrase like that. Yeah, where it's like it's query trash can, query
recycle, query recycle.
Or why not just be explicit? Query remove revisions and query remove body.
Well, that's the question. And then what does all mean, right? All then combines them back together.
Yeah, sorry. You're saying, sorry, under what Dustin was just saying, or I don't know who was saying it anymore actually, but purge. If I purge a version, then I could pull it again if it's still up on a remote somewhere, and that I could just purge and pull all day long and just remove blocks and add blocks. Is that I just want to make sure I'm clear on that.
Sounds really gross when you phrase it that way, but yes, yeah.
Yeah. That was the suggestion, yeah.
Or no, it should be binge and purge. That was Metallica reference from the 90s.
Oh, I didn't get it.
For what it's worth, like if we were going to cluster a bunch of dangerous commands away somewhere, I think it's the ones that edit history as opposed to the ones that are like removing something from a remote or removing a commit from your local disk, but not removing it from history. Like maybe those need to go into like a query edit or something, or query history edit or something, that packages up all the things you might do with like squashing or removing or whatever.
Yeah, and this is where, I mean, it's the opposite. The question that we're actually asking here is what's the opposite of save? Which is because we need, I save to add versions. Do I delete? Do I blah, 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 right? Yeah, and so grouping all those together, and as you said, Rob, of like history modification. I don't want to put them under a subcommand because they're so like, you can't do anything until like the whole purpose behind query is to get people to type save and then type push, because that's how we create healthy networks of open data. But we make mistakes all day long. I use remove all the time, and the mental model of it. And for me, it's a real fear. I'm very like, okay, we got to stop and think about this, like drop or purge or recycle or binge or whatever the phrase is for like just storage manipulation, because the fact that everybody on this call was not clear on the like double meaning of remove means we don't stand a chance in hell of surviving, documenting this properly. So we need to make a point of like talking through those as well. With that, it's 2 minutes past the hour. Does anybody want the final word on this conversation? Burning thoughts?
It's exciting and interesting and stimulating conversation. I'll say that.
I had a lot of fun.
We should make sure that either, because this was such a good conversation that I'm glad we had here, but potentially could have been used to recruit some people who encountered this or have points of view. I'd love for us to make sure that we're like advertising the RFCs in the Discord and maybe tagging individual people who've actually run into this stuff.
It's a really good point.
If those names come to mind, and then begging them to come to this and tell us their life story.
I agree. I also think that we just need to take some of the thoughts we're developing here and then explicitly go do feedback sessions on them. Because this is our chance. I think this is really our chance to organize our thoughts. And as much as we aren't the audience, I do think that we are the proto audience, the people that know the wiring well enough to come up with the suggestions that need to be workshopped. So that bit I think is really helpful. Yeah, with that, this has been an hour. It's been a delightful hour. Thank you so much, everybody. I feel like we have a lot of clarity. So next steps on this, I've been taking notes on a HackMD. I'm going to work those into a comment on the RFC, and then I'm going to try and work as much of this as possible into the RFC itself, and then tag y'all for review.
Very good.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks, everybody.
See you
Have a
guys
lovely
in
week.
May.